"You're coming with me." The words cut through the desert air with the weight of iron. They weren't a question nor an offer. They were a fact, unbending, final, like the granite cliffs that rose from the wasteland beyond. The heat shimmered off the red-dusted road, clinging to every surface: the cracked leather of the horse's tack, the scuffed boots of the man who spoke, and the pale, exposed skin of the woman standing in disgrace beneath the merciless sun. Her name was Lena, though in that moment even her name felt stolen. 3 men lingered a few paces away, her late husband's kin. The Graysons. Their expressions were a twisted cocktail of triumph and contempt, the kind of look men wear when cruelty feels like justice. Their wagon sat tilted behind them, wheels coated in dust, as if it too had shared in the act of her dispossession. The eldest, a sharp-faced man whose eyes glinted like flint chips, spat into the dirt and sneered. "She's ours by right. Property of the family. You've got no call to interfere, Abel." Abel didn't answer him. His gaze stayed fixed on Lena. He saw the way her shoulders quivered, the way she avoided every eye, her tormentors, and even his. She stared instead at some invisible point, far on the horizon, as if by sheer will she could disappear into it. Abel swung down from his saddle in one smooth motion. His steps toward her were measured, deliberate, carrying the kind of calm that was more dangerous than rage. Without a word, he pulled a woolen blanket from behind his saddle and placed it around her bare shoulders. His hands were careful, clinical, touching only cloth, not skin. It was not a gesture of ownership, but one of respect, a recognition of her humanity when others had stripped it away. The blanket was heavy and rough, but to Lena it felt like armor. Her fingers clawed at the edges, holding it tight, as though it was the last thing tethering her to life. Only then did Abel turn his eyes to the Graysons. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but immovable. "Get off my land." He didn't shout. He didn't draw his weapon. Yet the words carried a finality that made the air itself heavier. The 3 men shifted uneasily. The eldest opened his mouth to argue, but something in Abel's stare stopped him cold. With a curse under his breath, he tugged his reins sharply. The horses stirred, and the Graysons mounted, their parting glares laced with venom, but dulled by the knowledge they had already lost. A cloud of dust rose as they rode away, swallowed by the horizon. Abel said nothing more. He adjusted the blanket around Lena, then gestured to his horse. "Mount up." Her legs trembled beneath her, but when she hesitated, his hand, firm yet steady, guided her to the saddle. She climbed with the awkwardness of someone drained of strength. Abel swung up behind her, and without another glance toward the ridge, he set his horse into motion. The ride back was wordless. The horse's hooves drummed against the cracked earth, the leather creaked, the wind whispered through brittle sage. Lena sat stiffly in front of him, her body exhausted, leaning just enough to feel the unyielding wall of his chest at her back. He made no move toward her, no demand, only the steady presence of someone who had nothing to prove. As the hours passed, the sky began to burn. The sun sank low, igniting the western rim in savage hues of orange and crimson. The light painted Abel's face in strokes of fire and shadow, revealing the lines etched by years of labor and solitude. He was a man carved by this land, hard, scarred, unrelenting, but not cruel. There was a stillness about him, an integrity that spoke louder than words. At last, as twilight deepened and the first stars pricked through, a pinprick of lantern light appeared ahead. Lena's heart lurched at the sight. a destination, a place she was being taken, not one she had chosen. Fear rose sharp and cold, even as relief fought to take root. The homestead appeared as they crested a small rise, a modest cabin of rough-hewn logs, a weathered barn, and a scatter of fences stitched into the earth. No ornament, no luxury, only the hard-won marks of survival. It looked less built than grown, as though the land itself had shaped it from endurance. Abel dismounted first. He reached for her, then his calloused hands steady at her waist as he lifted her down. Her legs faltered, refusing to hold her, and for a moment she leaned against him. His grip firmed, kept her upright, and then just as firmly released her. Inside the house was sparse but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall swept clear of ash. The furniture bore the smooth polish of long use. The air carried scents of wood smoke, leather, and old coffee. Abel pointed to a closed door off the main room. "That's yours. Clothes are on the bed. They belonged to my mother." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned instead to the stove, striking a match and coaxing a flame into the kindling. The fire crackled alive, filling the silence with a sudden, fragile warmth. His shadow, cast long across the wall, seemed as much a part of the cabin as the logs that framed it. In the small room, Lena found what he promised, a plain cotton dress and a worn shift laid neatly across the quilt. They smelled faintly of sun and lye soap. When she shed the blanket and slipped into the clothes, they hung loose on her frame, but they covered her, shielded her, gave her back a measure of dignity she thought lost forever. When she emerged, Abel had set 2 tin plates on the table, beans and bacon, humble fare, but hot and real. They ate in silence. The scrape of forks, the sigh of the fire, the whisper of wind at the shutters, these were the only sounds. Across the table, Lena studied him, this man who had intervened not with bluster, but with a simple, irrevocable choice. He didn't demand her story. He didn't even ask her name. And in that silence, she found a mercy she hadn't known she craved. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, she felt something more than humiliation or fear. She felt safe. The first days on Abel's land unfolded in a rhythm that felt foreign to Lena. Silence was its own language here, one that wrapped itself around her like the blanket he had first placed on her shoulders. She rose each morning to the muffled sounds of his boots crossing the floorboards before dawn, the groan of the barn door opening, the low murmur of cattle beyond the window. By the time she entered the main room, there was always something waiting for her: a slice of bread, a bowl of stew left covered on the table, a tin cup of water drawn fresh from the well. Abel never announced these offerings, never demanded thanks. He simply went about his work as though her presence in his house had always been inevitable. Lena moved carefully through the rooms at first, a ghost haunting borrowed space. The house was small, but steady, every object chosen for utility rather than beauty. There were no lace curtains, no polished silver, no delicate ornaments, only a sturdy table, a few hand-carved chairs, shelves, stacked with jars of beans, flour, and coffee. The hearth dominated the cabin, its fire both heat and heart. In her own room, she discovered a small wooden box tucked into the corner of the dresser. Inside lay fragments of another life, a set of whittled birds, their wings fragile under her fingertips, a faded photograph of a stern woman whose eyes mirrored Abel's, a chipped porcelain teacup with the handle broken clean off. She held it gently, marveling at its uselessness. It was cracked and incomplete, yet somehow beautiful still. Like her, Abel gave her space, as if it were something sacred. He did not intrude on her solitude, did not press her with questions. He existed around her like the land itself, vast, watchful, patient. She found herself listening for the sound of his return each evening, the door closing, boots thudding, the scrape of chair legs on the floorboards as he sat to eat. One afternoon, driven by a restlessness that pressed like hands against her ribs, Lena stepped out onto the porch. The sun was sharp, the air crisp with the scent of sage. In the distance, Abel was mending a fence, his hammer striking with steady rhythm, each movement purposeful. He didn't turn to acknowledge her, but she noticed the briefest hesitation in his pace, a fraction of a pause that told her he knew she was watching. It was the first time she had chosen to step into the open air since arriving. He gave her the dignity of treating it as ordinary. The days stretched into a fragile routine. She began to sweep the cabin, fold the blankets, and tend to small tasks, more for her own need of order than from any sense of obligation. The work was grounding. Each simple act, the brush of straw across the floor, the tightening of a loosened button, stitched her slowly back into herself. But safety was a fragile illusion. One evening, as the sun bled down behind the ridges, Lena caught sight of movement on the eastern horizon. A rider. Too far to distinguish a face, but her body recognized the threat before her mind did. Her stomach knotted, her hands went cold. She knew who it was. The Graysons. Watching. Waiting. The figure lingered on the ridge for nearly an hour before disappearing. By the time Abel came in from the fields, her nerves were frayed raw. She said nothing, but he seemed to sense it anyway. He spread an oilcloth across the table, disassembled his rifle, and began to clean it with quiet, deliberate motions. Metal clicked against metal, the hiss of the lantern overhead, illuminating each piece as he polished and checked the mechanism. He didn't mention the rider. He didn't need to. His silence was an acknowledgement he knew the danger. He was preparing. Lena sat near the hearth, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching. The ritual of his work, the calm precision of it, was oddly comforting. He wasn't sharpening violence. He was building assurance. She understood then that his act of protection had not ended the day he wrapped her in that blanket. He had taken on her safety as a burden he intended to carry, no matter the cost. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, Lena lay awake in her small room, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards as Abel moved about. She realized that, for the first time in years, she wasn't lying awake in terror. She was lying awake in possibility. The shift came slowly, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through hard earth. One morning, she discovered a neglected vegetable patch behind the house. The soil was overgrown with weeds, but beneath them the dirt was rich and dark. On impulse, she knelt, her fingers digging into the earth, pulling at roots until her hands were stained with soil. She worked until the sun pressed heat into her back, until sweat stung her eyes. By evening, the plot was cleared, and she felt a kind of bone-deep exhaustion that was not despair but satisfaction. The next day, she found a small spring of wild mint near the fence line. She gathered some, washed it carefully, and left a glass of cool mint water on the porch rail. When Abel returned from his work, he stopped, looked at the glass, then at her where she sat quietly on the steps. He picked it up, drank it down, and gave her a single nod of thanks. It was enough. Lena began to mend a shirt of his stitching the tear with precise, even movements. She swept the floors until they gleamed, washed the dishes until they shone. These weren't gestures of subservience, but of partnership, of building something shared. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Abel often whittled small figures from scraps of wood, his knife moving with steady grace. Lena would watch her thoughts turning over like stones in a stream. And then one night, without planning it, she spoke. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she told him of her husband, a kind man, but weak, lost to fever. Of the Graysons, who had stripped her of everything after his death. Of the final cruelty the day they had cast her out with nothing but shame. Abel listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on the flames, his jaw tight with restrained fury. When she finished, the silence was thick but not empty. It was the silence of a burden shared, a truth witnessed. For the first time since she had been cast out, Lena no longer felt invisible. And for the first time since he had brought her here, Abel finally understood the weight of what she carried. The sky had been bruised purple all afternoon, heavy with the promise of a storm. Cattle shifted restlessly in the pasture, their lowing uneasy against the charged air. Lena stood on the porch, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles whitened. She had seen them before. Abel did 3 riders cresting the eastern ridge silhouettes, cut black against the fading light. Her stomach dropped. The Graysons. Abel emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. He followed her gaze to the ridge. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he walked with measured steps toward the house. "Go inside," he told her. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of iron. She hesitated. "It's them." "I know," he said, softer, but firmer, his eyes locked on hers. "Go inside." There was no anger in his tone, only the certainty of a man who had already decided what must be done. Lena retreated into the cabin, but she left the door open a crack. She could not bear to close herself off from what was coming. Abel did not take his rifle. He did not arm himself with anything more than the weight of his presence. He stood on the porch steps, feet planted, a solitary figure carved from stone waiting. The 3 riders descended into the yard dust, rising around their horses' hooves. The eldest Grayson, thin-faced and sharp-eyed, reined in first. His sons flanked him, one broad and brutish, the other lean with a cruel smirk, twisting his mouth. "We've come for what's ours," the old man sneered, his voice a thin rasp against the wind. "The woman. Send her out." Abel's eyes were steady, unblinking. "She's not yours. She is by law and by right." The younger son barked, swinging down from his saddle with a length of rope in hand. He took a step forward, his boots crunching in the dirt. "We'll take her same as we took her land." That's what happens when a woman can't keep a farm on her own. Abel's voice was low, but it carried with the force of a closing door. "She stays." The smirking son advanced another step, the rope dangling like a promise. Lena's heart slammed in her chest. She wanted to scream, to rush out to do something, but she was rooted to the spot behind the doorframe. Then Abel moved. It was a blur of sudden, brutal efficiency. He stepped off the porch and met the man halfway, his entire body a wall of force. The collision sent the younger Grayson sprawling into the dirt, the rope tumbling from his hand. The father and other son reached instinctively for the pistols at their belts, but froze. Abel straightened slowly, his eyes burning with a cold, merciless fire they had never seen before. "Leave," he said, His voice was flat, unshaken, a prophecy carved into the air. "And don't come back." The eldest Grayson faltered, his thin mouth pressed into a hard line. For all his venom, he had not expected this immovable resistance. The younger son groaned on the ground, wind knocked from his chest. The other shifted uneasily in his saddle, his bluster thinning beneath Abel's steady stare. The wind rose, tugging at coats and hats, rattling the barn doors. Thunder cracked across the sky, sharp as gunfire. The Graysons hesitated, pride warring with fear. But then the father jerked his reins, snarling, "Come on!" They grabbed the fallen son, hauled him onto his horse, and wheeled their mounts. Their angry shouts scattered in the rising storm as they galloped back over the ridge. And then the heavens opened. Rain came in sheets, pounding the earth, running in rivulets across the hard-packed yard. It soaked Abel to the skin in seconds, plastering his shirt to his chest, dripping from his jaw. He stood unmoving, letting the storm wash over him as though it were a baptism. Lena burst from the doorway, rushing to his side. She caught his arm, her face upturned to the rain. "They'll be back," she said, her voice trembling with fear and fury. "Yes," Abel replied. His gaze was fixed on the horizon where the Graysons had disappeared. "But so will we." The storm passed quickly, leaving the air cleansed sharp with the scent of wet earth and sage. In its wake, a quiet settled, not the fragile quiet of before, but a deeper, sturdier peace. A peace born not of avoidance, but of confrontation, faced and survived. The following days carried a new rhythm. Lena no longer stayed within the confines of the house. She followed Abel into the fields, watched him mend fences, helped where she could. She learned to patch the roof, to stack wood, to gather herbs from the foothills. Her hands, once delicate and unused to labor, grew strong and sure. Abel softened in small, unexpected ways. He left a wildflower on the table one morning, purple petals bright against the worn wood. He showed her how to grind coffee beans properly, how to whistle low to calm, skittish cattle. Words were still few between them, but they were no longer needed in the same way. Their communication existed in glances, in the silent rhythm of shared work. One evening, Lena placed the chipped teacup she had found on the windowsill. She had painstakingly glued the pieces back together its cracks, forming a dark web across the porcelain. But she had filled it with tiny purple creek flowers, fragile blooms that caught the fading light. Abel came in from the fields, mud on his boots, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He stopped when he saw it. For a long moment, he stood still, his gaze fixed on the mended cup. Slowly, he reached out his rough finger, brushing one of the petals. When he looked at Lena, his face transformed. A smile not large, not loud, but slow and genuine spread across his features, lighting him from within. It was the first time she had seen him smile. And in that smile, the cabin ceased to be merely his house. It became their home. The storm had tested them, and they had not broken. Together, they had endured. The seasons turned, wrapping the valley in shifting colors and moods. Autumn draped the hills in gold, the cottonwoods blazing like torches against the fading grass. Winter followed, with its sharp, white silence, snow piling against the fences, the creek frozen into a silver ribbon. In spring, tender shoots pushed through thawed soil, a promise that the land, like the heart, could recover after being stripped bare. For Abel and Lena, life began to take on a rhythm that was no longer merely survival. It became a partnership. At dawn, Abel would rise his boots, thudding softly across the floorboards. But now Lena rose too. She wrapped herself in a shawl, and together they stepped into the biting cold of morning. He showed her how to scatter feed for the cattle, how to check the water troughs so ice didn't choke them. Her hands were clumsy at first, but soon the work became second nature. Inside, she learned the kitchen as if it were a new language. Bread dough beneath her fingers, beans, simmering slowly, herbs she had plucked herself drying above the hearth. She took pride in the small details: swept floors, neatly mended shirts, water drawn fresh and cool from the well. These weren't acts of service, but acts of belonging, proof that she was no longer a guest in Abel's house, but its keeper beside him. Abel noticed. He didn't speak of it, but she caught the way his eyes lingered on her when she set a jar of mint leaves on the table or when she straightened the quilt over his bed. He carried himself with the same steady weight as always, yet beneath it there was a subtle shift, an easing of solitude, a loosening of the hard lines that had defined him for so long. Winter was the true test. The first storm came with little warning, a wall of gray sweeping down from the northern ridge. Snow fell in heavy, smothering sheets, blanketing the valley. Abel moved with tireless resolve, checking the barn-breaking ice in the troughs, hauling wood until his shoulders ached. Lena refused to remain inside. She wrapped herself in a coat too large for her frame and followed him into the storm. Together, they fought the elements, hauling water, keeping the fire alive, spreading hay in the barn. That night, when the wind screamed against the walls and snow sifted through the cracks, they sat by the hearth with bowls of stew. Abel's face, lit by firelight, looked older, carved deeper by worry. But when his gaze shifted to her, there was warmth in it, a rare softness that startled her as much as it comforted her. "You don't have to do all this," he said quietly, as though speaking the thought aloud surprised him. "Yes, I do," she answered simply. "I won't let you carry it all alone." He stared at her for a long moment, the storm howling outside, before giving a single slow nod. No more words were needed. By spring, the bond between them had taken root as firmly as the wildflowers by the creek. They moved in sync, checking fences, repairing roofs, planting a small patch of vegetables Lena had claimed behind the house. The rows were crooked, the seedlings stubborn, but it was hers, and Abel never once corrected her. Sometimes she caught him watching her in quiet moments, the tilt of her head as she hummed to herself while kneading bread, the concentration in her brow as she patched his shirt. Those looks carried something heavier than gratitude. They carried recognition. But the Graysons had not forgotten. On more than one occasion, Lena glimpsed a rider on the eastern ridge, a lone sentinel keeping watch. Sometimes it was one of the sons, sometimes the old man himself, hunched and vulture-like in his saddle. They never approached, but their presence was a shadow that lengthened each time. Abel said little of it, but his actions betrayed him. He reinforced the barn doors. He sharpened his tools more often. He oiled the rifle with a methodical precision that spoke of readiness. One evening, after spotting a rider vanish over the ridge, Lena confronted him. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked, her voice low. Abel paused, setting down the cloth he had been using to polish the barrel. His eyes were dark in the lamplight. "No? Then what happens when they come back?" He studied her face for a long moment, then said, "Then we stand." Lena's heart hammered at the finality in his voice. But when he reached across the table, his hand brushing hers, a strange calm washed through her. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone in her fear. Summer arrived with its harsh sun, but also with renewal. The cattle grew fat on green pastures. The garden sprouted beans and squash. Abel taught Lena to ride properly, her skirts tucked awkwardly as she clutched the reins of the old mare he had broken years ago. She laughed a sound she had not recognized in herself for so long, and Abel, hearing it, let the corners of his mouth lift in a smile that was rare and unguarded. Life was not easy, but it was theirs. And yet, beneath the rhythm of work and the fragile bloom of companionship, the shadow of the Graysons lingered. Their claim on Lena had not been abandoned, only delayed. Abel knew it. Lena felt it in her bones. The valley was peaceful, but peace was never permanent on the frontier. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in crimson light, Lena saw them again, 3 riders on the ridge closer than before. She shivered, though the air was warm. Abel stepped out beside her, following her gaze. He did not move, did not speak. But his jaw tightened and his hand rested unconsciously near his belt, where his revolver hung. "They'll come again," Lena whispered. "Yes," Abel said. His voice was steady, like the land itself. "But so will we." The words hung in the fading air, a promise as much as a warning. For Lena, it was no longer just about fear. It was about choice. She was no longer the woman stripped of dignity, cast into the dirt by cruel hands. She was building something here alongside a man who stood not as her owner, but as her equal. And she would not give it up, not to them, not to anyone. The ridge no longer held shadows. The Graysons came at dawn, 3 riders outlined against the pale sky, their figures black and jagged like the teeth of a broken saw. The sound of their horses carried through the valley iron hooves, drumming the earth with a rhythm that spoke of intent. Abel was already outside splitting wood in the early light. He straightened as he heard them, the axe head buried in a log, his body still but charged with a coiled readiness. Lena, standing on the porch with a pail of water, froze. The pail slipped from her hands and clattered against the step, spilling its contents across the boards. Abel turned his head, caught her gaze, and in that silent moment told her everything. Stay steady, stay strong. The Graysons rode into the yard with the arrogance of men convinced the law, bent to their will. The father, thin and sharp as barbed wire, reined in first. His sons flanked him, broad and brutish, their smirks carrying the weight of cruelty practiced often and without remorse. "Morning, Abel," the old man drawled, voice gravelly with spite. "We've come for what's ours." "She's not yours," Abel answered evenly, his hands loose at his sides, but near enough to his belt that the gleam of steel was implied. The eldest son dismounted, swaggering as he stepped forward. His gaze flicked toward Lena, who stood rigid on the porch, her face pale but her chin lifted. "Law says a widow belongs to her husband's kin," he sneered. "And we mean to take her back." Abel moved down one step, his body forming a barrier between Lena and the men. His voice was low, steady. "Law or not, she stays." The yard seemed to hold its breath. The horses shifted uneasily. The chickens scattered the air itself, heavy with the weight of choice. The younger son spat into the dust. "Always thought you were better than us, Abel. Always thought your land, your pride meant more than blood. But pride doesn't keep a man alive." His hand brushed the butt of his revolver, slow and deliberate. Lena's heart hammered in her chest, but she did not move. She saw Abel's stance, harden his shoulders, squared like the granite cliffs beyond the valley. He didn't draw. Not yet. The father clicked his tongue. Enough words. Give her over Abel, or we'll take her. The eldest son's hand twitched the subtle prelude to violence. And then it happened, fast, brutal, inevitable. The son went for his gun. Abel's hand blurred to his own. 2 shots cracked like thunder, echoing across the valley. Dust leapt at the eldest son's boots, his revolver clattering to the ground as he fell backward, clutching his bleeding arm. The younger son cursed and drew, but Abel had already shifted his revolver steady. Another shot rang out, and the younger stumbled his hat, spinning into the dirt, his weapon falling useless. The old man sat frozen on his horse, eyes wide with rage and fear. "You'll regret this, Abel," he hissed. "You've made yourself an enemy you can't beat." Abel's voice carried cold and final. "I already beat you when I chose not to be like you. Leave now, or I'll finish what you started." The old man hauled on the reins, his horse wheeling sharply. He spat into the dust, gathered his wounded sons, and retreated the way they'd come, their figures shrinking against the pale morning light. When silence finally settled again, it was sharp and ringing like the echo of a bell. Lena stood trembling on the porch, her breath ragged. Abel holstered his revolver slowly, his eyes scanning the ridge until he was certain they were gone. Only then did he turn back to her. "They'll return," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Yes," Abel admitted, "but not today." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the distance between porch and yard, no more than a few steps, yet heavy with all that had just passed. Then Lena moved forward down the steps until she stood before him. Her hand, small but firm, reached for his. "You didn't have to stand for me," she said softly. His gaze searched hers, his voice rough. "Yes, I did." The day wore on, each task cloaked in the shadow of what had occurred. Abel checked the fences, repaired the damage where bullets had scarred the barn wall. Lena worked in the kitchen with shaking hands, the sound of the shots still echoing in her memory. By evening, the fear had settled into something else, resolve. She knew the Graysons would not stop, but she also knew she would not leave. Not now, not after Abel had risked his life to protect her dignity, her choice, her right to exist without chains. That night, the storm clouds gathered. Rain lashed against the windows, wind howled through the cracks. Abel sat at the table, rifle across his lap, his silhouette a silent guardian in the flicker of the lantern. Lena came to him barefoot, her shift clinging to her frame from the damp. She placed her hand gently on the rifle, pressing it down until his eyes met hers. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," she said. He stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he set the rifle aside. The storm raged outside, but inside a different kind of storm settled into calm. Abel and Lena sat side by side, hands intertwined, 2 solitary souls who had chosen at last to face the world together. For Lena, the fear was no longer paralyzing. It had transformed into fire. Whatever the Graysons brought, she would meet it not as a broken widow, but as a woman reborn in the quiet strength of a man who had said simply, "You're coming with me." And this time, she went willingly. Morning after the storm came quiet and clear, the air washed clean by the rain. Sunlight spilled across the valley, in golden bands, illuminating the wet grass and the faint steam rising from the earth. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the broken branches scattered in the yard, in the faint smell of gunpowder that clung to the porch, and in the memory of what had almost been lost. Abel rose before dawn, as always, though sleep had been restless. He moved with his usual steady rhythm, hauling wood to the shed, feeding the animals, checking the fences for storm damage. Yet Lena noticed the difference. His shoulders carried a weight heavier than the logs he stacked. His silence was not the silence of calm, but of calculation, of a man running through possibilities and preparing for the next inevitable confrontation. She watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough. Her hands worked the flour and water, but her mind kept drifting back to the moment he had stepped in front of her, unflinching against 3 armed men. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt not only shielded but seen. By mid-morning, Abel returned to the house. His boots were caked in mud, his hair damp with mist. Lena met him at the door with a cup of strong coffee. He accepted it without a word, nodding once in thanks. He drank standing by the hearth, his eyes fixed on the flames. "They'll be back," Lena said quietly, breaking the silence. Abel looked at her expression unreadable. "Yes." "Then we can't just wait for them." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes held steady. "We have to prepare." Something shifted in his gaze. A flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect. He set the cup down, the clink loud in the small room. "What do you suggest?" She drew a breath. "Teach me to shoot, to defend myself. I won't be a burden to you, Abel. I won't hide inside when the danger comes again." For a long moment he studied her. His jaw tightened as though weighing the risk against the truth in her words. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "All right. But you learn my way, safe, careful, deliberate. No bravado. Just survival." The next days took on a new rhythm. Abel continued his work as rancher and watchman, but now he also became a teacher. Out behind the barn, he set up bottles on a fence post, placed a revolver in Lena's hands, and showed her how to hold it. His hands, rough with years of labor, covered hers, steadying her trembling grip. "Breathe," he said softly. "Don't fight the weight. Let it rest in your hand like it belongs there." She fired the first shot with her eyes squeezed shut, the recoil jolting through her body. The bottle remained unbroken. Abel didn't scold or sigh. He simply adjusted her stance, his touch light but sure. Again. By the 5th shot, she opened her eyes. By the 10th, she shattered the glass. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. Abel saw it and allowed himself the smallest curve of approval at the corner of his mouth. Day after day, the practice continued. Her hands grew steadier, her aim sharper. She learned not just to shoot, but to reload swiftly, to clean the weapon with careful precision, to respect it as a tool and not a talisman. Abel said little, but she could feel his pride in the nods he gave, the patience with which he corrected her grip, the rare but powerful words "good." Again. In the evenings, they worked side by side, repairing the cabin roof, patching the barn, tending the animals. What had begun as his solitary burden was slowly becoming shared labor. Lena no longer felt like a shadow haunting his house, but a partner carving out a place in the land's relentless rhythm. One afternoon, while gathering kindling near the creek, Lena paused. The water rushed cold and clear, and in its reflection she saw herself not the shivering, stripped widow who had once stood broken in the dust, but a woman with mud on her hem, calluses beginning to form on her hands, and a quiet fire in her eyes. That evening, she carried the kindling inside and found Abel cleaning his rifle at the table. She set down the wood, then placed her hand over his, stilling the movement. "You've given me back more than safety," she said softly. "You've given me myself again." For a long moment, Abel looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he set the rifle aside. "You gave that to yourself, Lena. I just made space for it." The silence that followed was not heavy, but warm. It stretched between them like a bridge, unspoken words traveling across. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. 2 weeks later, smoke rose on the horizon. Abel saw it first standing in the pasture, with a lasso in hand. He narrowed his eyes, his entire body stilling. Lena followed his gaze, her heart tightening. A column of dark smoke coiled upward, far too close to be a natural fire. "They're burning out a neighbor," Abel said grimly. "The Graysons. They're sending a message." Lena's hand went to her chest. "We should help." "We can't," Abel interrupted, though his voice held no cruelty. "By the time we ride, it'll be done. That's their way. Strike, quick, retreat, fast. They'll come here next." And with those words, the fragile calm that had grown between them splintered. The valley would not remain untouched. That night, Lena sat by the window, staring at the ridge where she'd once seen the Graysons watching. Abel moved about the room, checking locks, loading weapons, setting lanterns in strategic places. She turned to him finally. "We can't just defend, Abel," she said. "We have to endure. Outlast them. Show them that no matter what they take or burn, they cannot break us." Abel paused, the lantern's glow catching the hard lines of his face. Slowly he nodded. "Then we endure. Together." The wind outside rattled the shutters, but inside something steadier took root. A bond forged, not just in survival, but in the choice to face the darkness side by side. And though the threat grew closer with each day, Lena knew with a certainty that surprised her this land, this man, this fragile sanctuary, they were hers now. She would fight for them. She already had. The first sign came not with sound, but with silence. It was midnight, the valley wrapped in a hushed stillness, too complete to be natural. Even the crickets had ceased their song, and the cattle in the pasture shifted uneasily, their low moans carrying in the dark. Lena stirred awake in her narrow bed, her breath quickening before her mind fully caught up. She rose, bare feet, cold on the wooden floor, and crossed to the window. There on the ridge, 3 faint shapes mounted unmoving, watching. She turned sharply as the floorboard creaked behind her. Abel was already awake, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the same ridge. He had been sitting in the dark waiting. "They're here," Lena whispered, though she knew he already understood. Abel's voice was low and steady. "Stay away from the window. Light makes you a mark." She obeyed, pulling back into the shadows of the room. The rifle in his hands gleamed faintly in the moonlight, oiled and ready. His calm was like iron anchoring her fear. Minutes stretched long, the riders holding their place like ghosts carved into the horizon. Then movement. A sudden flare of orange as one man struck a torch. Another followed. The glow spread, painting the night in cruel light. "They mean to burn us out," Abel said flatly. He handed Lena the revolver she had trained with. "You remember everything I taught you." Her fingers closed around the grip. Her pulse pounded so hard she feared it might shake the weapon from her hand. But she forced herself to nod. "I do." He gave her a look sharp searching, then placed a box of cartridges beside her. "Load. Keep steady. Don't waste shots." The horsemen began their descent, torches blazing. The crackle of fire carried on the wind. Abel moved to the door, his posture unhurried, but lethal, a man stepping into a role he had long expected. Lena followed, her revolver clutched tight. They stepped out onto the porch, the night air cold and sharp. The riders spread into a line, torches, high faces, hidden behind bandanas. Abel's voice rang out calm, but carrying like a bell through the dark. "That's far enough." The riders slowed but did not stop. One called out, his voice harsh and mocking. "Hand over the woman, Abel. She's ours by right. You can walk away." "She's not yours," Abel said, each word like a hammer blow. "Not by law, not by blood, not by anything that counts in this world." The leader laughed a jagged sound. "Then we'll burn you both where you stand." He hurled his torch. It landed short, bouncing in the dirt flames, licking dry grass. Abel fired once, a crack of thunder that split the night. The torchbearer toppled from his saddle, his body hitting the earth with a thud. Chaos erupted. The remaining riders charged, guns, barking, torches flying. Lena dropped to one knee as Abel had taught her, firing toward the nearest shadow. Her first shot went wide, but the second found its mark, shattering a torch and plunging part of the yard back into darkness. Abel's rifle spoke again, precise and devastating. A rider screamed, clutching his arm as his horse bolted into the night. The third man veered wide, circling toward the barn. Lena saw the glint of his torch, arching high, aimed at the haystack piled against the wall. Without thinking, she sprinted forward, skirts tangling around her legs. She raised the revolver, breath steady, and fired. The torch flew from his hand, spinning into the dirt and guttering out. The rider wheeled his horse, fury flashing in his shout. He leveled his pistol at her. For a heartbeat, Lena froze, the world narrowing to the black eye of the barrel. Then Abel's shot rang out. The rider crumpled sideways, his gun discharging harmlessly into the night as his body hit the ground. Smoke stung Lena's throat. She turned, chest heaving, to find Abel striding toward her rifle, still steady, eyes sharp. "You all right?" he asked, his voice clipped but urgent. "Yes," she managed, though her hands shook violently. He scanned the yard. One man lay dead, another wounded, and gone the third, sprawled in the dirt. But Abel's posture didn't ease. His gaze returned to the ridge where faint movement suggested more might be watching. "This isn't finished," he muttered. They dragged the fallen rider to the edge of the yard, stripped him of weapons, and left him bound beneath the cottonwood tree. Abel worked with cold efficiency, Lena assisting without question. When they returned to the porch, the fire in the grass was dying, beaten back by the damp earth. Inside, the silence pressed heavy. Abel set his rifle on the table, then turned to her. "You did well. You kept your head." Her breath shuddered out. "I thought I was going to die." "You didn't," he said simply. "And you saved the barn." She sat heavily in a chair, revolver still clutched in her lap. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "They won't stop, Abel. Not until one of us is gone." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze distant. "Then we make sure it's them." The lamp flame flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. For a long time neither spoke. Then Lena lifted her eyes to his voice, low but certain. "I won't run. Whatever comes, I'll face it here. With you." Something in his expression softened just slightly. He stepped closer, crouching before her, so they were level. His hand brushed her knuckles rough against her trembling grip. "You're stronger than you know," he said quietly. For the first time since the night she was cast out, Lena believed it. The storm had shifted. No longer was she simply a victim carried by others' choices. She had fought and she had stood her ground. And as the night stretched on with dangers still lingering beyond the ridges, she knew the battle for her freedom and for their fragile sanctuary had only begun. The dawn that followed was not gentle. It came with a brittle stillness, the air sharp with the acrid smell of burned grass and gunpowder. Abel was already outside, his silhouette stark against the rising sun, repairing the fence line where bullets had splintered posts. Lena watched from the porch, wrapped in his mother's old shawl, the revolver still heavy at her side. Sleep had not come for either of them, but exhaustion had sharpened into something else, resolve. When he came back to the house, his face was set, jaw unyielding. "We need to be ready," he said. "They'll come again, and they won't come in threes next time." Lena nodded. She had no illusions left. "Then we prepare." The day was spent in relentless labor. Abel hauled buckets of water from the creek to fill barrels near the barn, and the house precaution against fire. Lena, under his instruction, learned to pack cartridges with a steady hand, her fingers growing surer with each one. They stacked supplies inside reinforced shutters and laid out weapons where they could be reached in an instant. Every task carried the weight of inevitability. In the quiet stretches, Lena found herself studying Abel as he worked. His movements were purposeful, honed by years of survival. Yet beneath the hardness, there was something else, an undercurrent of care, not just for the land, but for her. Each time he checked her aim, adjusted her stance, or reminded her to breathe between shots, it was more than instruction. It was trust. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Abel returned from scouting the ridge with grim news. "They've gathered more men," he said flatly. "At least half a dozen. Maybe more." Lena's breath caught. "Then they mean war." His eyes met hers, steady, unwavering. "They've chosen it. But we don't face it alone." She frowned, confused, until he explained. "I rode to town before dawn, left word with the sheriff. He'll bring men when he can. But until then, it's us." The weight of those words settled heavy, but instead of fear, Lena felt a strange clarity. "Then we hold until help comes." Night descended, thick and restless. The two of them sat inside by the fire, the house fortified, weapons within reach. Abel cleaned his rifle again, his hands methodical. Lena watched him, then finally spoke. "Why?" she asked softly. He looked up. "Why what? Why take me in? Why risk this fight for someone you barely knew?" His gaze lingered on her, long and searching. "Because no one deserves what they did to you. Because a man has to stand for something or he's nothing." And because his voice trailed, but the silence spoke more than words. Her chest tightened. She wanted to press him, but the moment was broken by the distant thud of hooves. Both froze instincts flaring. Abel snuffed the lamp with a swift motion, plunging the room into shadow. "They're here," he murmured. They moved to their positions, Abel at the window with his rifle, Lena crouched by the door with her revolver. Outside torches flickered on the ridge, far more than before. The glow snaked down the slope like a line of fire riders, fanning into the valley. Lena's mouth went dry. "There must be 10 of them." "Closer to 12, Abel confirmed. His tone was calm, but the air around him vibrated with intensity. "Stay low. Aim only when you must." The riders thundered into the yard, their voices carrying on the wind. Insults, threats, demands. At their head rode the oldest Grayson, his face twisted with fury. He raised a torch high. "Abel," he bellowed, "this ends tonight. Send her out, or we'll burn you alive." Abel's reply was cold as steel. "You'll never lay a hand on her again." Gunfire cracked. The fight began. The night exploded with sound rifles, booming pistols, snapping horses, screaming as bullets struck. Abel fired with ruthless precision, every shot deliberate. Lena steadied herself, squeezed the trigger, and saw one rider topple from his saddle. Her ears rang, her arms trembled, but she forced herself to keep going. The attackers fanned out, some circling toward the barn, others toward the creek. Abel shifted positions with practiced fluidity, covering both flanks, his command sharp but steady. "Left window 2 coming through, keep them off the port." Lena obeyed, firing until smoke stung her eyes. She saw one man stagger, another retreat. But the pressure was relentless. Torches flew flames, licking at the barn's dry wood. "No," Lena cried, darting toward the door. Abel caught her arm. "Stay back. They'll burn everything." He cursed under his breath, then handed her the rifle. "Cover me." Before she could protest, he was gone, sprinting into the yard with a bucket of water. Bullets whined past him as he doused the flames, his body moving with reckless courage. Lena braced the rifle as he'd taught her, sighted on a shadow, raising a pistol at his back, and fired. The man crumpled. Her heart pounded, terror and exhilaration colliding. She had saved him. Abel dashed back inside, soaked and breathless, eyes blazing. "Good shot," he said, then without pause reloaded his pistol. The fight dragged on, a brutal exchange of fire and fury. Slowly, the riders began to falter. 2 lay wounded in the dirt, 3 had fled. The rest circled warily, their torches sputtering low. Finally, the elder Grayson shouted above the chaos, "This isn't over, Abel. You can't hold forever." Abel stepped onto the porch rifle, leveled, his silhouette stark against the flames. "Then come back and see what happens. I'll be here. Every damn time." The men hesitated, fear creeping into their bravado. One by one, they wheeled their horses, retreating into the night. The yard fell silent, but for the crackle of dying flames and the harsh sound of Abel and Lena's breathing. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Abel lowered his rifle and turned to her. "You held your ground." Lena's hands shook, the revolver heavy with smoke and sweat. "We both did." He looked at her, then really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Not just gratitude, not just respect, but recognition, 2 lives bound now by fire and survival. Outside, the stars blazed cold and bright over the scarred valley. Inside, the house still stood battered but unbroken. And so did they. The battlefield quiet that settled over the ranch was almost worse than the chaos itself. The night air hung heavy with smoke, and the copper tang of blood drifting through the broken shutters. Abel moved methodically, checking each corner of the house, before finally leaning his rifle against the wall. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had carried the weight of 2 lives through fire. Lena sat at the table, her revolver still clenched in her hand, though the fight had ended. Her knuckles were white, her breath shallow. The fire in the barn had been beaten back, the raiders driven off, but the echoes of gunfire still rattled in her chest. She didn't realize Abel was beside her until his hand closed gently over hers. "It's over," he said, his voice low and steady. She swallowed hard. "For tonight." His gaze held hers. He didn't offer false comfort. "For tonight is enough. Tomorrow we'll face what comes." With his quiet insistence, she let the revolver slip from her grasp, the weight of it clattering onto the table. Abel fetched water and a rag, and without a word, began cleaning the grime and powder burns from her hands. His touch was firm, practical, but there was a gentleness in the way his rough thumb brushed across her wrist. She had been touched with violence, with cruelty, with indifference, but never like this. Her throat tightened. "You should see to yourself," she murmured, noticing the blood seeping through a tear in his shirt. He glanced down, as if only now realizing the wound. Graze. Nothing more. She reached for the rag, but he shook his head. Later, he finished wiping her hands before tending to his own shoulder, tearing strips from a sheet and binding it tight. She watched, torn between admiration and fear, realizing how close she had come to losing him out there in the dark. When the adrenaline finally ebbed, the silence was deafening. They sat across from one another, shadows flickering on their faces from the dying fire. Lena spoke first, her voice trembling but fierce. "I won't run." Abel frowned slightly. "No one asked you to." "I need you to understand," she pressed on. "The Graysons thought they could shame me into silence, break me into nothing. But I won't give them that victory. This is my fight too, Abel. My home now." For a long time, he said nothing, only studied her, as if measuring her resolve. Finally, he nodded once. "Then we fight together." The words were simple, but they settled into her bones like steel. By morning, the sheriff arrived with 2 deputies, dust rising from their horses, as they rode into the battered yard. The lawmen surveyed the damage, the burned patch by the barn, the bullet-pocked fence posts, the dark stains in the dirt. "Hell of a battle," Sheriff Callahan muttered, dismounting. "I take it the Graysons paid a visit." Abel's expression was unreadable. "They tried?" "They failed." The sheriff crouched beside one of the bloodstains, running his fingers over the churned earth. "Won't fail forever. Men like that don't let go easy." His sharp eyes shifted to Lena. "You all right, ma'am?" She met his gaze squarely. "I was. Until they made me fight for my life. Now I'm better than all right. Now I'm ready." Callahan's brows rose, but he said nothing more, only gave Abel a look that carried the weight of old understanding. "We'll keep patrols close for a while. But truth is, out here, a man's justice comes as fast as his gun." When they left, the valley felt empty again, but not safer. Abel and Lena spent the next days repairing what had been broken. Together they rebuilt the fence, scrubbed the blood from the dirt, and patched the holes in the shutters. The work was endless, but it gave them both something they hadn't known in months' purpose. At night, when the day's labor left them too weary for words, they sat by the fire. Sometimes Abel would read from an old Bible, his voice low and steady. Sometimes Lena would mend clothes, the rhythm of her needle as grounding as any prayer. And sometimes, in the silence, their eyes would meet and nothing needed to be said at all. One evening, as the light faded to silver and the coyotes cried from the ridges, Abel set aside his rifle and spoke. "You know, there was a time I swore I'd never bring anyone into this fight. Figured the land was enough company. Figured I didn't need more loss." Lena's hands stilled on the hem she was stitching. And now? He looked at her, his eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper. "Now I think I was wrong. This fight isn't mine alone. Maybe it never was." Her breath caught the truth of it, settling between them like a vow. She set the needle aside and leaned forward, her voice steady. "You're not wrong anymore." That night, when the wind rattled the shutters, neither of them felt the cold. As the weeks passed, Lena found her footing on the ranch. She rose before dawn to tend to the hens' chopped wood alongside Abel, and even learned to ride the perimeter with a rifle slung across her back. The woman who had once trembled in the dust now carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had chosen her place in the world. Abel watched her sometimes with pride, sometimes with worry, but always with the awareness that the valley had shifted. It was no longer his alone. It was theirs. One afternoon, as they stood side by side mending the barn roof, Lena glanced at him and said softly, "I used to think strength was shouting the loudest, striking the hardest. But it isn't, is it?" He hammered a nail into place before answering. "No, it's standing when the world tries to knock you down. It's keeping what's yours, even if the whole damn ridge comes against you." She smiled faintly. "Then I think we'll be just fine." For the first time in years, Abel believed it. The peace that followed was fragile, like glass set upon a stone, but it was real. And in that fragile peace, something else began to grow, slow, steady, undeniable. It was not spoken, not yet, but it was there, in the way Abel's hand lingered a fraction longer when passing her a tool, in the way Lena hummed softly when she cooked, in the way the house no longer felt like his alone. The valley still bore scars of violence, but it also bore the first green shoots of something stronger. A life rebuilt not from desperation, but from choice. And in the quiet, they both knew the fight wasn't finished. But neither of them would ever face it alone again. The thaw of spring came slowly to the valley, dripping from the eaves of the barn and softening the earth beneath the fences Abel and Lena had repaired with their own hands. Days lengthened, grass grew green again, and with every sunrise the ranch began to resemble not a battlefield scarred by fire and bullets, but a home renewed. Yet beneath the quiet hum of new life, both of them knew the Graysons were not finished. Men like that never vanished with one defeat. Abel kept his rifle oiled and close. Lena learned to shoot with precision, her eyes narrowing against the sight until she could strike a tin can from the fence line at 50 paces. He watched her, once pride hidden in his still expression, but when she lowered the rifle and met his gaze, the smallest curve of a smile betrayed him. "You're teaching me to fight," she said, brushing ash-dark hair from her face. "You're teaching yourself," he corrected softly. For weeks, the horizon stayed empty, the ridge bare of riders. The valley pulsed, with life calves bawling in the pasture lambs, wobbling on unsteady legs. Lena's laughter carried on the wind as she coaxed a stubborn hen from beneath the porch. Abel had not heard laughter in this house in years. The sound did something to him he could not name, like sunlight reaching a place he thought had been sealed in stone. But peace is always fragile. It was a Sunday evening when the storm broke. The sky hung low purple with dusk, and Abel was on the porch sharpening a blade when the first shots rang out. Not close warning shots echoing from the ridge. Lena froze in the doorway, eyes widening as the riders came into view. The Graysons had returned. 3 figures outlined against the dying light. This time, they did not slink or circle like coyotes. They came head-on, bold and deliberate, rifles slung, pistols at their belts. Abel stood slow and steady. His voice was calm when he spoke. "Go inside, Lena." She stepped forward instead, standing beside him. "Not this time. Not without me." He looked at her, then really looked, and something passed between them. Not defiance, not recklessness, partnership. A vow already lived, spoken now without words. The riders drew closer, dust curling around their horses' legs. The eldest Grayson, hard-faced and bitter as dried bone, reined in at the yard. His voice cracked like a whip. "This ends tonight, Abel. You kept what's ours long enough. Hand the woman over, and maybe we let you walk away." Abel's stance did not change. "She's not yours to take. She never was. She's property by law. Law don't give you what you never earned," Abel cut in, his voice like stone. The youngest Grayson, hot-blooded and sneering, slid from his saddle hand on his revolver. "Then I'll take her back by lead." Lena's voice rang out before Abel could speak. Strong, steady. "Try and you'll never draw breath again." She raised her rifle, the barrel gleaming in the last light of day. The men hesitated. Not because they feared her skill, they did not yet know it, but because they heard the truth in her tone. Silence stretched taut as a wire. Then the youngest made his move. His revolver cleared leather, fast and reckless. But Abel was faster. His rifle cracked once the shot precise, and the pistol flew from the young man's hand, clattering useless to the dirt. The outlaw screamed, clutching his shattered wrist. The elder Grayson snarled, spurring his horse forward. Lena didn't flinch. She fired the shot, grazing his hat clean off his head. Her second bullet split the earth at his horse's hooves, making the animal rear. Abel's voice thundered across the yard. "Enough?" The riders froze. His eyes burned like iron from the forge, steady and merciless. "This land is mine. This house is hers. You come again, you won't leave standing." For a moment the 3 men teetered on the edge of violence. Then one by one they faltered. Rage twisted their faces, but defeat weighed heavier. With curses spat into the dust, they hauled the injured son onto his horse and turned back toward the ridge. Their retreat was not peace, but it was surrender. The valley fell silent again, save for the ragged beat of Lena's breath. She lowered her rifle slowly, her hands trembling only after the danger had passed. Abel stepped closer, his presence steadying her. "You stood your ground," he said quietly. She swallowed hard. "Because you taught me how." He shook his head. "No, because you always had it in you." In the hush that followed the truth, neither had dared to speak, rose between them. She was no longer the broken figure he had wrapped in a blanket weeks ago. She was whole again, forged in fire and storm. And he was no longer a man resigned to solitude. He had let someone into the silence, and she had not only survived it, she had transformed it. Later, when the stars spread wide across the sky, they sat together on the porch rifles, leaned beside them, hands brushing in the quiet. Abel's voice, roughened by years of dust and silence, broke the stillness. "You know, Lena, the night I brought you here, I thought it was out of duty. Thought I was just keeping someone alive who'd been wronged." He paused, searching for words. "But now I know. You weren't just saved. You saved me too." Her eyes stung, not with grief this time, but with something fierce and luminous. She turned her hand into his, lacing their fingers together. "Then we saved each other." The night wind carried the scent of sage and wet earth, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the soft sigh of a land finally at rest. And in that quiet, Abel and Lena began not just to endure, but to live. Their story would not be told in town with a clamor of gossip or the roar of barroom lies. It would be told in the steady rhythm of years, fences mended, fields sown, winters endured, and springs welcomed. It would be told in the laughter that returned to the valley, in the way two broken lives fused into one whole. For the scars they carried, like the cracks in a mended cup, were not signs of weakness, but of the strength it took to be made new. And so, against all odds, Abel and Lena built more than a home. They built a sanctuary, a place where the past no longer ruled them, where the future was theirs to shape. Together,